You're here because you want to know everything there is to know about the Maximus 9 Hero motherboard from ASUS. Well, good news, I can give you the 10-minute version. Let's figure it out. This is the Maximus Hero 9 from ASUS. This is an ROG motherboard that is Republic of Gamers. It is the middle-of-the-road Republic of Gamers. Well, it's sort of, I don't want to say entry-level, because it's really not entry-level when you look at it and you look at the features, but it is sort of the everyman gamer motherboard for socket 1151. Socket 1151 is for 6th and 7th generation Core i5, Core Intel, i5, i3, i7, Pentium Celeron CPUs. That's socket 1151. That's the one that has 16 PCI Express lanes directly into the CPU and 4 PCI Express lanes through the DMI, or the DMI has about 4 PCI Express lanes worth of bandwidth. This is the Z270 chipset, which means that it has 24 PCI Express lanes through the DMI interface to the CPU available for peripheral connectivity. That's things like onboard USB, onboard M.2, onboard, whatever other peripherals there are, SATA. Well, not exactly, sort of, kind of SATA. But yeah, Intel 6th and 7th generation CPU. This particular motherboard is outfitted as you would expect. It's got 4 DIMM slots. It has 3 PCI Express by 16 slots, 2 of which are armored and reinforced, made for big heavy GPUs that might be putting a lot of physical stress on the PCI Express by 16 connectors, and then a by 4 connector at the bottom through the DMI. Now, depending on what other peripherals you're using, the bottom slot may run it by 4 or by 2. By default, it runs it by 2. So if you're going to use a PCI Express NVMe like the Intel 750 and the PCI Express version, you're going to want to use that. Absent from this motherboard is SATA Express and U.2, although you can get an M.2 to U.2 adapter if that's your fancy. This motherboard does have 2 M.2 slots, both of which support PCI Express connectivity, one of which supports SATA connectivity, and one of the M.2 supports cards up to 110 millimeters in length, the other up to 80 millimeters in length. And it also has mounting points for 3D printed gear, but we'll get more into that in a moment. It has the fancy new USB 3.1 front panel connector. This is so that you can run, 10 gigabit USB 3.1 at the front panel. So in terms of peripheral layout for PCI Express, as far as that goes, the 2 gray slots will run it by 16 by 0 for like a GPU, or if you're gonna run dual GPU or a GPU and a 10 gig Ethernet card, something like that, it would run it by 8 by 8, and those slots are directly into the CPU. Everything else is through the DMI. There are also 3 PCI Express by 1 slots, which you would use for a video capture card, maybe an add-in Ethernet adapter, something like that. It does have 1 built-in Intel NIC, an i219V, so you could add a second NIC if you wanted through the PCI Express by 1. The M.2 is located above the first by 16 slot below the CPU, so I think it's going to have ample airflow. The second one is located near the bottom of the board, just above the bottom physical by 16 slot. So the placement of the M.2 motherboards, A+, it's really good. They should have good breathability. The audio solution on this is a Supreme FX based around the Realtek ALC 1220, and the Supreme FX codec is located at the corner of the motherboard as far away from everything as possible on an isolated part of the PCB. Even the left and right channels are isolated from one another so as to minimize noise and minimize interference. Let's take a look at the connectors on the motherboard so that you get an idea of functionality. Starting from the top of the board, going in a clockwise direction, you've got your 8-pin CPU power. You've got 3 4-pin fan headers. This is for your CPU, optional, water pump, whatever. Then you've got your first of 2 RGB headers. You've got your Q code readout. Then you've got your Mem OK button so that you can, if you're overclocking and doing stuff and you just want to reset the memory timings or, check the memory or whatever, you use that Mem OK button. There are also 4 LEDs here located at the top corner of the board that give you diagnostic information as to the CPU, the DRAM, the graphics card, and the boot device. And so if there is a problem with one of those devices, you can see it here on the LED indicator just to make it so that you don't even have to look up the Q code in the manual, but you totally can look up the numeric code on the motherboard in the manual and see what the error is. Then you've got a 3D printer mount hole, so if you're going to 3D print some accessories, you want to 3D print some bling for your motherboard, you can screw it into your motherboard there, then your ATX power connector, then your USB 3.1 front panel connector, then another fan header, then your 6 SATA connections, 2 more 4-pin fan headers, another 3D mounting point so that you can screw in something that you've 3D printed to accessorize your motherboard. Then we've got another 4-pin fan header, this time for a water pump, but there's also water pump temperature and water flow inputs. Now, if you're going to be doing overclocking, 5 gigahertz and beyond, an all-in-one water cooler is what I would recommend. If you're going to run a custom loop, you can totally use the water flow and water temperature sensor inputs on this motherboard to have the ASUS software and the ASUS motherboard actually monitor your custom loop cooling solution. And you're going to need a custom loop if you're going to do extreme overclocking, because good Lord, Kaby Lake puts out the heat. So keep that in mind, it's nice. At the bottom edge of the board, there is a 5-pin connector that is for an external fan controller. So just like the past 2 or 3 generations of ASUS boards, if you need more fan headers and you want to be able to control it through the ASUS software, you can get a board that plugs into the motherboard and it'll give you 3 more fan headers and 3 more temperature inputs. Then you've got your front panel connector, another Aura RGB header, another 4-pin fan connector, a temperature sensor, and then you've got your ROG header or USB 2.0 header, so that if you have an internal peripheral like your power supply has USB monitoring or your water pump has USB monitoring, you can plug it into the internal USB 2.0 header. But it's also good for the ROG front panel that we've seen on the last several generations of ASUS ROG motherboards. So if you want the fancy ROG front panel, you can totally use that with the connector header on the motherboard. Then you've got your standard USB 3.0 front panel header. Then you've got TPM input for if you're going to use the TPM module for security, trusted computing, and all that. And then you've got a bunch of buttons along the bottom of the board. Now the big start button will of course start the computer. There's also a reset button. There is a safe BIOS mode where if you've been doing overclocking and the system won't post or whatever, you can hit that and hopefully you will get a safe startup with conservative settings for your memory, your CPU, that kind of thing, so that you can maybe get a good boot. And then you also got a physical retry button, which, if you were doing overclocking and maybe sometimes the system stumbles a little bit when it first boots and it's like, hey, something went wrong, you just hit the retry button and it'll retry all the settings again without resetting anything. Then you've got your Thunderbolt header, and then you've got your front panel audio connector, which is, of course, on the isolated part of the printed circuit board. Also at the bottom is a slow mode and mode for liquid nitrogen. So if you wanted to run liquid nitrogen cooling, or you want to go for the world overclock record on Kaby Lake and use liquid nitrogen, you can do that with this board. It has the appropriate modes for liquid nitrogen control. Slow mode is useful if you are booting the machine for the first time under liquid nitrogen, or you've got an extreme overclock or something like that. It will boot the machine without the without the extreme overclock insanity, I guess. Now let's talk about the fan headers. I don't know if you were counting. Did I count 7 fan headers? 8? 9? Well, there are 9 fan headers. But because there are so many fan headers, some of them are shared in terms of control. Now, 2 of the fan headers are 3 amps of output. So that's suitable for running, a big custom loop water cooling pump, or a fan splitter where you've got one fan header that's going to 2 or 3 fans in your system. You can't monitor the tachometer with that, obviously, but you could run multiple fans off of the 3 amp headers, big water pumps, whatever. 2 of the headers support 3 amp connections, or 3 amps of power. All of the other fan headers support up to 1 amp, which should be plenty. The 2 that are linked are CPU fan and CPU optional, so those are linked in terms of control and in terms of how they behave, but that works out really well if you've got a push-pull configuration, or if you've got a radiator, like a 240mm radiator with 2 fans, you can use CPU and opt for that to have the motherboard actually control that instead of the water pump, if that's your thing. That's usually how I do it when I'm running like a 240mm closed loop cooler, so it is a useful, handy feature. Then the Water Pump Plus and H-Amp are linked as well. So if those headers are meant for, closed loop water cooling or custom loop water cooling, and both of those are linked for DC or PWM control. So just keep that in mind. Now, real quick, at the back panel, we've got our clear CMOS button, a BIOS flashback button. You can upgrade the BIOS without having a CPU installed. Your M.2 Wi-Fi slot, there is an HDMI 1.4 connection, DisplayPort 1.2. There are 4 USB 2.0 ports and 4 USB 3.0 ports, 1 anti-surge LAN, which is the Intel i219V I was mentioning before, 1 optical SPDIF out, and then 5 gold-plated audio jacks. Now, the headphone connection for the onboard audio can do headphone impedance detection, so you don't have to set any jumpers or anything like that, and it supports a wide range. In fact, there are 4 presets for different headphone impedance settings for whatever type of headphones that you might be running. Now, in terms of DDR4 and the overclockability there, it does support DDR4 up to 4000. The fastest kit that I have is a DDR4 3200. Right now I'm running Crucial Ballistics DDR4 in this particular board that I did my overclocking and testing with. I've got an i7 7700K that'll hit 5 gigahertz no problem, and on this motherboard, as expected, it hit 5 gigahertz no problem. Let's take a look at the UEFI. Hey, look at that, we're running the Hero 9. We've installed our i7 7700K, new CPU installed, which is exactly what you want to see when you first turn on a machine. This is great, it works. Let's run setup. Now we're in the UEFI. Curiously, it did not take us to the easy mode screen, which I guess Maybe normal for the Hero motherboard, or maybe it's just because I haven't cleared CMOS, I'm not sure. Now the first thing that you always want to do is update the UEFI. When you get one of these boards, you always want to update the UEFI. And in fact, I know that there's a newer version of the UEFI available, 0701, newer than the 0604 that I've got on here. So before I do my testing, I'm going to update that. But this is a quick tour of the UEFI, so this is literally first boot of the motherboard. Now I could update the UEFI without even installing the CPU, but that's a video for another day. All right, so my favorites is an area of the UEFI where you can tag features that you commonly change or features that you want at your fingertips, and it will show up on the My Favorites screen. So if like the DRAM frequency is buried or the CPU core limit is buried and you want to run that, then you can just set it on My Favorites and you don't have to find what screen it's buried on. You can just come back to it. Let's take a look at the main section. The main section just shows you your BIOS version, what CPU you got installed, how much memory, the clock speed, system language. There's also security information for setting a password, that sort of thing. Then we've got Extreme Tweaker, which is, target CPU mode frequency, 4.5 gigahertz. This is 4.2 on a 7700K. Its built-in turbo boost will turbo as high as 4.5. I know this CPU will reach 5 gigahertz no problem though. Target DRAM frequency, 2.4 gigahertz. This is DDR4 3200, so with the extreme memory profile, we can get up to 3200 no problem. Target cache frequency, 4.2 gigahertz, and target CPU graphics frequency, 1.1 gigahertz. Now, most of you guys, I figure, probably are not going to be running the iGPU, which will help you a little bit in terms of overclockability running an external GPU, because that's one more thing that does not have to work right at extreme speeds if you're not going to use the built-in GPU. These options give you control over the main overclocking features, but you do have things like Tweaker's Paradise where you can really get in there and mess with the base clock, the phase lock loop voltage, anything that the DMI voltage, anything that you might want to mess with to get you a little bit more speed or a little bit more stability. You can also mess with the CPU cache ratios, that sort of thing. Here's our CPU configuration where we can turn on hyperthreading, thermal monitor, Intel virtualization technology, VTD pass-through, those kinds of things. Here's the platform management configuration where you can turn on power management for both the DMI and PCI Express peripherals. The system agent configuration, I'm going to go ahead and turn on VTD because I like that. And I'm going to go back and turn on hardware virtualization because I use that. That way I can run virtual machines and maybe do hardware pass-through. Maybe do an updated Linux hardware pass-through video. Thunderbolt support is disabled. There's no onboard Thunderbolt. The ROG effects, the onboard LED and the Q-code LED postcode, we can set it to auto. Onboard LED can be enabled or disabled. Onboard devices. You can set the PCI Express bandwidth, whether it's X2 or X4 for the bottom by 16 slot physical. So if you're going to install a PCI Express NVMe in there, you'll probably want to set that to X4. Otherwise, if you're using an M.2 NVMe, you would just use one of the M.2 slots. You can also configure M.2 number 1 to be SATA or PCI mode or auto, where it'll automatically just try to do what it needs to do. But then we've got the controls for the as media controllers, so we can enable, disable them for the front and back USB 3.1 10 gigabit. This is sort of a Gen 2 USB 3.1. It's the USB 3.1 protocol at 10 gigabit. That's an important distinction. And if the whole USB 3, USB 3.0, USB 3.1 Gen 1 is confusing, you should check out the Kaby Lake overview video because all of that is explained there. USB Type-C power switch, auto, RGB lighting. And this is nice because you can turn off the RGB lighting when the system is in hibernate or sleep. In case you've got a side window and your computer's like in a bedroom or something and you don't like the RGB lighting when the computer's off because it's making the room lit up so that you can't go to sleep, just turn it off. This disables the optional Bluetooth and Wi-Fi controller. This disables the Intel LAN controller or boot from LAN. It's disabled by default if you don't plan to boot from a LAN, which most of you probably don't. Then you can just leave that disabled. APM, hard drive smart information, USB configuration. You can configure, your USB situation, which ports are enabled, disabled. The monitor lets you see what your CPU, water pump voltage, fan speed, fan voltage, temperature, the whole 9 yards. You got Q-fan configuration. It'll auto-tune if you run Q-fan tuning. You got chassis fan configuration where you can configure the RPM target and where it wants to step up, where it wants to step down, and the time that it takes to step up, step down. You ever be sitting near a computer and it's just constantly going, it's changing between two speeds really quickly, just instantaneously. This will let you set a slow ramp up or a slow ramp down. So like over 5 seconds, it would ramp the fan up to a faster speed, or 5 seconds would ramp the fan down to a lower speed. So I generally recommend setting it so that it ramps down at a low speed, but it ramps up rather quickly, like 0 seconds or 1 second to ramp up, so that you get a better thermal response in case your computer is suddenly generating a ton of heat. It'll respond really quickly to that, but then it won't slow down for like 5 or 10 seconds or whatever, so that you don't notice it as much. And then boot lets you configure your boot options, compatibility mode, CSM, if you're going to run UEFI or if you're going to run legacy like BIOS mode, that sort of thing. And then under tool, you can use flash to flash upgrade the BIOS, do the setup animator, ROG, OC panel. This is the Hero, so it supports the ROG front panel connector thing, which you can find at the bottom of the motherboard. You can see the SPD information on your installed memory, and also graphics card information if you have a graphics card installed. So I'm going to save and reset. We're going to boot into Linux and see if that works. Hey, look at that. We booted into Fedora. That's a good sign. Didn't lock up or do anything weird. Wired Ethernet worked. This particular device does not have built-in Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, so I don't see Wi-Fi or Bluetooth there as expected. Let's see if I can hear audio. Yep, I can hear audio. LS USB-T is the layout of our USB configuration. LS PCI, this is our PCI devices. And this is our I/O memory layout. And the network works perfectly. So happy to report, everything works on Linux. The graphics, of course, is the Intel iGPU, so the iGPU is working. If I were to go into all of the features in the software bundle, well, that could be its own video, honestly, because there's a ton of stuff in the software bundle. Let's take a quick look. Okay, let's take a look at a block diagram and the software bundle for the Hero 9. This is the block diagram for the Hero. This gives you an idea of how the peripherals are arranged with respect to connectivity through the PCH, through the DMI, and the PCI Express peripherals, and how those are connected, memory layout, that sort of thing. Now the Hero features an ROG water cooling zone, which is a water pump header as well as a flow indicator. So there's a water flow indicator input. If you're running a custom loop and you've got, a water flow indicator, you can run that into the motherboard, and the ASUS platform will monitor the flow through your custom loop cooler. It also has water in and out temperature sensors, so you can deploy 2 temperature sensors to monitor the temperature of your water in your closed loop system. The software bundle here also includes Sonic Studio 3. Sonic Studio 3 lets you control audio routing so that different applications go to different audio output devices, because maybe you want your game in your headset, maybe you want a movie to go to external speakers, maybe you want other sounds to go to different output devices. I mean, when you think about your HDMI audio source, headphones, analog audio out, maybe you have a monitor that has built-in speakers, there's a lot of sound devices on any modern computer, and this gives you control so that you can have some applications go to some outputs and other applications go to other audio outputs, so that you've got flexibility with how you want audio routed through your computer. You've also got per application volume control that's a little more sophisticated than the built-in Windows audio control. Sonic Radar 3 is a part of the suite. Sonic Radar, what it does is it gives you a visual indicator of where sound is coming from, or more specifically, where a game has asked the sound hardware to render a sound like as if it is coming from that area. So if you're playing a game and something is happening in the northeast quadrant, well, the sound radar will let you visually see that. And if that feels a little bit too much like cheating, there's also the Sonic Radar 3 Audio Boost. The Audio Boost feature, it works similarly, but instead of giving you a visual indicator, it just boosts the audio. So if you're detecting a sound, say, from this quadrant here, it'll just boost the sound so that you can hear it better, so that you're able to use your own ears to determine directionality that might be a little bit more difficult if the sound were quiet. Aura, of course, is the name of the bundled RGB control software, which gives you the 2 independent onboard LED areas, plus you've got the RGB output. The RGB output on the motherboard is a different separate zone, and you can sync the lighting and sync the RGB control to a bunch of different sources of data from within the machine. The Aura software will let you control, what color you want, but also what it responds to. So you can flash, and you can respond to temperature, strobe, color cycle, whatever you want to do as far as RGB lighting, if you're into that kind of thing. The Hero also supports the ASUS fan extension card. This plugs into a header on the motherboard, and then you provide external power to this control. This board gives you 3 more fan headers and 3 more temperature sensors that will be wired into the monitoring system on your motherboard so that you can use the onboard motherboard features to control fan speed, monitor temperature, and you don't need any extra software or anything extra. It's just built into the platform. So if there's not enough fan connectors on this motherboard or not enough temperature inputs, you can add this expansion board and have more fans and temperature inputs, but that still run through the motherboard so that you don't have to have any other software. Game First is also bundled with this motherboard. Now, it is an Intel i219V, but this is packet prioritization software, which will let you use multiple network connections that your computer may have. So if you've got a Wi-Fi card installed and the wired Ethernet or multiple wired Ethernet cards, it will help you route and prioritize your traffic so that the game traffic is prioritized ahead of, say, a torrent that you might be running in the background, or file sharing services that you might be running on your computer, something like that. Also included is RAM cache, which will boost system performance by using RAM. Now, this really is good if you're running, 32 gigabytes of RAM. Well, it'll help even if you're running 16, because not really a lot of stuff uses beyond 8 gigabytes of RAM unless you're a mega tasker. But 32, 64 gigabytes of RAM, whatever you might be running, this will have the system keep more stuff in memory to improve performance. And so they did a little test here where they're copying files back and forth, and they're able to lower the time it takes to copy a files from about 5.5 minutes to about 3 minutes, just by using a lot of the system memory for caching. You can also use RAM disk to actually have a program run entirely from RAM. It's a little different from caching, but it will actually use memory as a physical drive. Motherboard also has Keybot 2, so that when the machine is off, you can just hit keys on the keyboard to get to various system functions. So like CLR will clear CMOS. You can press enter on the keyboard to power the computer on. If you press delete with the computer off, it'll boot right into the UEFI. F12 will control XMP. F11 will do a one-click overclock so that the system will attempt to do overclock. Now, I like the Dual Intelligent Processors 5 auto-tuning from within the ASUS software from within Windows versus F11. I think the software is a little bit more sophisticated because it'll do burn-in testing and that sort of thing. But you can do F11 and enable all of the presets for one-click overclocking. Keybot will also let you set up macros, even complicated macros with delays, so that you can hit keys to do complicated functions from within a game. I have not really had a lot of time with these motherboards and the platform yet. This is really just an overview. This is not extensive testing. I have not really had these for a long time yet. In about 3 weeks or 4 weeks, as we've had a chance to put these through extensive testing, we'll probably have a better verdict. But so far, 5 gigahertz on 75% of CPUs looks like it's a legit thing, at least for the 7700Ks. So that's exciting, because even though it's a 4-core part, 5 gigahertz is nothing to sneeze at. So that's been a quick overview of the Hero 9 from ASUS. If you get one of these, let us know. If you're thinking about getting one of these, come to our forum, because this thread is going to be long-lived. This thread is going to be as long-lived as this motherboard is, which is probably at least 18 months. So if you're not watching this in January, you can probably come to our forum. There's a link to the forum below and find a lot of really good, relevant discussion on this motherboard, people who have bought this motherboard, the features that it has, some of the confusing terminology around, was it USB 3.0 or USB 3.1 or USB 3.1 Gen 1 or USB 3.1 Gen 2? If you're not sure about the i7 7700K or the i5 7600 or the particulars, there's a video about that and the general features of the processor and the general features of the Z270 chipset across a wide range of motherboards. There's a link in the description. So you should totally check that out. If you want to learn more about the platform and build a computer and put something together, we will help you at level 1. Join us in the forums. I'm Wendell, and I'll see you there.